What's going on, workforce? Brian and Chris here, and we're going to dive into part 2 of We Are Vana'diel, an interview with Yoshi-P, especially as it relates to Final Fantasy XI. I covered part 1 over on Ginger JRPG. I haven't actually covered this one as I skimmed it, and I didn't really feel like there was a lot of Final Fantasy XI excitement in here, but there's obviously things that we can glean from Final Fantasy XIV and maybe even some hints at Final Fantasy XVI as we just reacted to that trailer. Chris saw that for the first time, and hopefully you guys enjoyed. Got a lot of positive feedback of our 2 reactions that we did in person, so I'm very pleased with that. Now, Chris,
we're looking at the mic and everything too.
Oh yeah,
so
we
got a lot of constructive feedback, and we appreciate all of the ideas and stuff on that. So it'll be a developing format.
So what we're going to do specifically in this video, we're going to go through the full interview and discuss it as we go down through it all. But it will include a link in the description. Part 3 is scheduled for June the 8th, so that from the time of this recording, that should be coming out here pretty soon as well. So note that we'll either cover that here as a discussion, or I'll be sure to make sure that you guys are well aware of any breaking news and information coming out of these interviews. Being that they're done in parts, I know that they're very well covered. Like, they're like, okay, he's not sitting here going like, and by the way, this is what we're gonna do. But we did get a lot of really good information about 11, especially from an AMA, that they're looking into bringing back that shared subscription between 14 and 11. I think that would be very healthy overall for both games, especially because I think that would help take out of a barrier for people to try 11 who maybe be playing 14 and don't know what's different, because they are 2 completely different styled games, obviously very generational with 11.
Imagine if they had a good launcher on PC that handled both, and a launcher that was good at all on Mac.
Yeah,
I think that would be a huge leap forward.
I can only imagine. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into it. Developer based on personal experience as a hardcore MMO player. For those of you who don't know Yoshi-P, he came in from Ultima Online. That's his background, and he did skip 11. And so it's that kind of, as an 11 player, does frustrate me, because it just feels like I never hear him praise 11, and he never really had a lot of experience with it. So let's go into it. Mr. Yoshida, I hear you have quite a background while playing MMORPGs. What is your first experience with the genre? And do you want to handle Yoshi's answers, and I'll answer for the other ones? We just back and forth it?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
That'd be Ultima Online, which I played since beta. Before I started, people were talking about how you defeat deer to obtain materials for sewing a vest, which could be sold for a high price. It made me go, what on earth are they talking about? And that intrigue was how it all started. And sure enough, when I started playing, I found myself defeating deer and selling vests. For me, earning money in this manner while also making myself stronger was a very new game experience. It was also an enormous shock when I learned that 3,000 people could play at the same time. Before that, Diablo was the only online game I knew, so I always thought of 4 players as the maximum.
Considering how the game allows users to place objects in the overworld, I can only imagine that it involved an outrageous amount of data traffic.
It's actually not that bad. Ultima Online features isometric 2D graphics rather than 3D graphics. The overworld is also designed as a grid with designated patterns for the cells, so the system only thinks about changing between different cells, similar to the meshes of modern standards. It was an ingenious idea that allowed for game masters to rewrite cell information in real time. It's an incredible design. I believe it's quintessential sandbox MMORPG that remains unsurpassed even to this day. So,
okay,
real quick, So we knew prior to this that Ultima was kind of his background. That's been something that's been referenced time and time again. He's also talked about his relationship to Blizzard games, especially his fondness for the Diablo franchise. There is kind of a common reoccurrence of people stating his admiration of things that WoW has done well over the years for the genre, because it's obviously so comparable to 14. But his love for Diablo has been something that has been there
persistent
for a long
and
time.
Consistent. Absolutely.
But he doesn't usually talk about these systems that, like, why something as a game dev, why he's admirable. Do you think that's like, do you remember him ever talking about these things as the meshes?
No. And maybe he has in more, like, I guess, Japanese focused interviews, but at its core, he's just comparing how that mesh in 3D game design today, kind of is that. And obviously being that it's 2D, and it's that grid system, that ends up being something that was much easier for them to kind of maintain and do. So you're not looking at massive amounts of data having to be sent back and forth, because this was back in the pre, Ethernet days of dial-up, right? Final Fantasy XI and even Phantasy Star Online, like, they were built with dial-up as the core component, as the core idea
And
behind
client-side hard drives weren't enormous, so you couldn't just say, well, like, let's just push it all to the client. Like those were limited too. As opposed to now, Diablo Immortal's like 25 gig, and it's in theory a phone game. So like that's absolutely wild. I will say that the thing that it makes me, I don't remember if he goes over in this interview, but the thing that he always learned from Ultima, that always strikes me as something that was like a lasting impression, was he talks about the communication from the devs. And while A, how much he appreciated it, and how much it was anticipated from the players, B, how like, because there wasn't enough of it, he always said, like, if I was ever in charge of my own MMO, communication is something that would absolutely be there. Whether the players were happy with what I had to say or not, communication and being transparent with my community is so important.
Absolutely. All right, so Mitsui asks, assuming that there are already a game developer by that time, did you have any interest in creating an MMORPG yourself?
I did. I'd say I wrote my first proposal for an MMORPG after working in the game industry for about 3.5 years. Back then, Hudson Soft believed that they would eventually need more than their existing series in order to stay in business, and often held contests for new projects. I wrote 3 proposals or so around that period, one of them being a space exploration MMORPG. Incidentally, the other proposals were to bring back Dungeon Explorer as a multiplayer title for PlayStation 2, and a multiplayer FPS. That is a wide variety of projects.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, Hudson Soft, I remember them. Bomberman, Adventure Island, Bonk. I remember those IPs. Yeah. Adventure Island, I was really big into as a kid. So you've been warming up to the idea since the golden age of MMOs.
At the time, Hudson Soft had developed equipment for the PS2 and the knowledge of internet-related specifications, so I felt we could make an MMORPG. With that said, I was a PC user even back then, and I remember writing the proposal while thinking, if it's going to be an MMORPG, it should be on PC. Were you also a PC gamer when it came to online games?
They threw me off with that dash. I was like, okay. And then Matsui says, yes, I was. However, it was the opposite for me, where it was the lack of online games for the PS2 that inspired me to purchase a PC. Now, Mr. Yoshida, you mentioned that you were hooked on Ultima Online, but what did you think of Everquest, which was just as popular?
I played a little bit of Everquest, but thought getting hooked on this would interfere with my everyday life, and fled to the dark age of Camelot beta test. I was actually quite busy with Bomberman 64, the second attack, when Everquest launched, so I was a latecomer to the game, and when I finally got around to playing it, I ended up not sleeping a wink until I reached level 8.
Considering Everquest's game design back then, reaching level 8 must have taken a really long time.
It sure did. My coworkers were also so hooked on Everquest that they never logged out, let alone came to work. If I wanted to get in touch with them, it was quicker to catch them in Norath, which is the setting of Everquest. One of my senior coworkers, who lived across the street from the office, was scheming to hook up the company's internet to his apartment, which was obviously completely out of line.
Those kind of stories were common during the golden age of online games, weren't they?
When I came to my senses and realized this could be a serious problem, that was when I heard of the beta test for Dark Age of Camelot was about to begin. So instead of aiming to be the best in the world in Everquest, I shifted gears and set out to achieve that in Camelot. You were quite famous as the top ranker in Camelot. During this peak of your MMO lifestyle, the Final Fantasy series announced their emergence into the MMORPG market. What were your thoughts on that back then? And I took your question.
You're good. I'll just let you go with it.
The dashes, man. The dashes.
They got you. They got me. They got you.
The Japanese ones are so conversational. I wish. Imagine if we'd started learning Japanese the day we started covering this game.
Oh, if only.
To be honest, it seemed very obvious to me that the game would basically be a Final Fantasy version of Everquest. I agonized over whether or not to play it, but the more I looked into Final Fantasy XI, the more it reminded me of Everquest, the game I'd been running away from.
So you believed Everquest and Final Fantasy XI would be very similar?
In my opinion, yes. I saw it using Final Fantasy to spread the MMORPG genre. However, Final Fantasy XI wasn't the first instance of that sort of phenomenon, which has always been common in the game industry. It was in the same vein as, for example, how Wizardry and Ultima are computerized versions of tabletop RPGs, or how Dragon Quest and the Black Onyx are RPGs that were localized into console games.
I see.
Thank you for the gifted sub, Farmer Girl. With these things in mind, and the fact that I was already aiming to be a world level ranker in Dark Age of Camelot, I was thinking I could start Final Fantasy XI a little later. However, I still kept an eye out for information on the game and often theorized on the reasoning behind their implementations. For example, with the mob tagging system, where the first party to attack from the monster gains possession of it, I imagined if it was intended to prevent console players from competing over monsters.
So Final Fantasy XI was a subject of research for you.
Yes, that's right. As someone who'd played various MMORPGs, I thought it'd be best to let everyone attack the monsters and have the loot distribute based on contribution. The mob tagging method would just end up with players competing to be the first to attack the monsters, and the risk of players using external tools to directly attack monsters' packets. And I remember thinking it was a bold choice for the development team to make. How does that feel as an 11 player?
Well, that's how it happened. Like, so you ended up having people and using, add-on like things that just to get the tags, because they were so heavily valued, and so people would spend hours upon hours trying to camp these various spawns. Now, ultimately, they ended up changing it so that it is a tagging system, but as people attack, within the first window, it ends up kind of doing like a lottery based off a contribution. So what you end up doing is you still compete, but you all kind of jump in, and then eventually it's going to reward the tag to somebody. Based either off their contribution or like contribution plus RNG or something like that nature. So that ended up kind of being how kind of it shifted. But it became like, there were people in their stories where it's like they were up at crazy hours in the morning just so that they can kind of get that tag, just so they could get that chance at that drop, because that drop's so heavily valuable. It was so value driven in that regards. And so you actually saw a lot of people gold selling economies huge in that kind of player driven economy mindset, because all right, you don't want to get up in the crack of dawn for that spawn, then you can either try to make money to buy it, or you can just buy the money.
WoW was doing that with not only rare spawns, which are a lot of what you described, where there were these rare pieces of loot, and those are still equipable. There's still rare spawns to this day that are worth the items that drop off them are worth half of a month's token, easily. And you're talking old items. You'll just want them for cosmetics, but the quest items also. And they've since moved to where quest mobs don't drop loot and are marked with it, because there was this harassment element of you could literally stop people. So for Final Fantasy XIV players, imagine an ongoing Raubon extreme that is just in the design of the combat system.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So let's go ahead and jump in. Let's see here. Did you cover this part? I just want to make sure, because someone who played Bears.
No, you're at first.
Okay, good, awesome. That's what I thought. I was like, I didn't want to just skip over that if I misremembered. At first, I was also hesitant about the mob targeting system, but after our team tried playing Everquest, I felt that vying over loot shouldn't mesh well with the personalities of Japanese players. Vying over loot means that you have to speak up and argue for yourself when there's a debate, or directly confronting the opposing party for their own benefit. Because Japanese people tend to struggle in those areas, we place a system with side limitations to make it as fair as possible. We also know that removing all hints of PvP elements that lead to a hostile environment, such as player killing and kill stealing, for similar reasons. And we still saw how there was a MPK, which was mob player kill, where somebody would bring a mob or a pack of mobs into a camp, and then essentially either despawn or die, and then the mobs would be sticking around and so then they'd go hunting. So there were still things that they had to go and figure out how to address, because players still found ways to kind of grief each other in Final Fantasy XI.
Yeah, in WoW, you couldn't have last hit do it, because then you would let somebody take on the rare spawn and hop in at the last second. And so it had to be first tag, or it had to be shared loot. Since the system wasn't set up as shared loot, it became this first tag. But if somebody from the opposing faction, for example, took your mob, what you could do is you could try to fear them into enemy mobs, because while you wouldn't get an honorable kill, so you don't get the little PvP benefit from it, if they die to an enemy mob, they take durability on their armor. And so it was incredibly common to kind of use this as a form of griefing to go get them killed by mobs. As long as the mob gets that last hit, you're oh no, my goal is to get them killed by monsters, not me, so that they take durability.
Gamers, man. All right, your answer here.
So Yoshi-P says the concept of thinking ahead to players to protect them is a very console game-like mindset, and I think it's very good. On the other hand, determining loot distribution based on damage dealt is easy to understand and feels fair, even if it doesn't go your way. It's not really a matter of which method is better, since both have their pros and cons.
Well, then what about the healer? It's if it's going off of damage dealt.
Well, a tank.
Yeah, it's like, sorry, sucks to be you. You know, it's like that in and of itself also has its own issues. I guess unless they're looking at it overall party wise, and how that breaks down. In our case, I feel that we adopted a system that better suited Japanese players who were new to the MMORPG genre. Speaking of systems, were there any other parts of Final Fantasy XI that stood out to you aside from its garbage collection? And Yoshi-P talked about how when he was looking over Final Fantasy XI, their garbage collection system from a memory management perspective was so well done, so powerful. And I just wanted to give you kind of
how did it work?
He didn't go into how it works. He just was impressed by how it, by it, because that's something that garbage collection, if you don't do that from a development perspective, that's basically considered a memory leak where the system holds on to memory and doesn't let it go. It doesn't get cleaned up. So then it doesn't become available, and it can cause all kinds of bugs, errors, and crashes down the road. All right, your answer.
Cool. Well, the question of how should we turn the Final Fantasy series into an MMORPG where players share the same world was answered by using the self-expressive job system from Final Fantasy III and by placing emphasis on the storyline in an MMORPG, which resulted in Final Fantasy XI. I believe Mr. Hiramichi made this possible as the person who brought Final Fantasy III into the world, not just simply by creating an MMORPG, but one with a Final Fantasy style storyline. It was an innovative idea for the genre, and Final Fantasy XI is without a doubt the first MMORPG to achieve this. That is the nicest thing I have ever heard him say about Final Fantasy XI.
To tell the truth, the Final Fantasy
Not
XI
just because, like you said, he doesn't talk about it.
Right.
Not as like a dig on it. Just like I don't ever hear him talk about it
at all. To tell the truth, Final Fantasy XI team also had people who believe stories are unnecessary in MMOs, so the planning stage of the game didn't consider the story as one of the main pillars of the game. At the time, most MMORPGs required you to spend most of your time leveling up, so players' gameplay time and levels were all over the place. And on top of that, the story progression would also vary, so the question was, how do we keep everyone on the same page?
So there were opinions like that after all.
Yeah, however, Final Fantasy XI's development team at the time had Mr. Kaito and Mr. Koshi, who argued that it was precisely because of these reasons that it would be meaningless for us to create a game without emphasis on story. And we were fortunate enough to have them, since our development team only had system-oriented people like me. We probably wouldn't have been able to create the game Final Fantasy XI is now.
And how many people were involved with Final Fantasy XI at the time?
That would have been anyone that wasn't working on 9 and 10, which we were being developed simultaneously. It was a point of effort between Parasite Eve 2 and Brave Fencer Misui teams from Okasha, and that the Mana and Chrono Cross teams from Tokyo. With the sheer number of people we had, it was almost felt like we were destined to make something great.
With a roster like that, anyone assigned to the scenario team would be eager to create an amazing story.
I think so, too.
Power is essential to game development, by which I mean something like a tremendous enthusiasm or strength in numbers. In Japanese, we often poke fun at the phrase, strength is the true power, but it's not exactly wrong. In the past, I asked Mr. Sakaguchi the candid question, would you have commanded everyone to work on Final Fantasy XI? To which he laughed and rightly answered, I would have waited till the very last minute, but would have gone through with it if necessary.
That would have been a textbook example of all hands on deck.
I will say that it is easy to compliment that stuff in hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
I know like WoW went through a phase like that and talk about it very fondly. It's kind of like that when you look at a good game and you say their devs were passionate, therefore good games come out of passionate devs. But the reverse isn't necessarily true, that bad games come out of dispassionate devs. There are passionate devs that just don't make good games. There are companies that throw all resources at things, and like Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 is a great example of this. That if you go back and watch the documentary, huge team, lots of resources, seemed to be very passionate about it, seemed to care, did not result in what they were imagining.
Mm-hmm.
So Yoshi-P says, perhaps that's how society accomplishes things when they really need to succeed. There may be varying opinions regarding how that style puts ongoing projects on hold or causes development to stagnate, but I'd say that was the culture or attitude of how things were run in the game development industry back then.
That's exactly what it's like to create an MMORPG during the golden age of online games. We were all going to make an MMORPG. Atmosphere was a greater cause that individual developers couldn't turn down in favor of other projects. So it was also felt like running away from the MMORPG development would make you a coward. Going back to the topic of stories, though, Final Fantasy XIV storytelling has also received high praise from around the world. As the director, did you always have an FF-style story in mind for 14?
A story was essential, since there'd be no point in making a Final Fantasy-style MMORPG without one. Furthermore, seeing as our goal was to create a numbered title to become the next Final Fantasy XI, I personally wanted to challenge ourselves to create an MMORPG with a story focused around one player. There still weren't any MMORPGs where the players were explicitly told, you are the hero of the story, so I wanted to delve into that concept and have players save the world in a straightforward manner.
I suppose the development your development experience with Dragon Quest X Online played a large part in that.
I definitely agree. MMORPGs are constrained by how they can't have player characters speak, but even then, defining them as your story will enhance the player's immersion in the game experience.
So I see. So that became one of the contributing factors for 14's great success. By the way, I heard that early on in 14, you held back when it came to making the player character emotionally expressive. Was that another aspect of making the game feel more immersive?
That was because when players are still unfamiliar with a game, depicting their characters with over-the-top gestures runs the risk of players thinking, that isn't me. More recently, however, since Final Fantasy XIV's story has progressed and presumably strengthened the bond between players and their characters, we now depict emotional expressions quite often.
I know what you mean. There is a considerable number of players who find it jarring when cutscenes force their character to express a certain emotion without their consent.
Have you ever heard him reference that that's why they're more expressive now? I always assumed part of it was just that the writing and the technology has improved so much. I didn't know that they were like intentionally holding it back and then now looked and said, okay, now it's time to be emotional.
It doesn't shock me because you think about, I would be somebody who's like, especially early on in 2.0, like, what's my character doing? Like, I don't even know that character that well. Like, what's happening? But then as my bonds with these characters have grown through the story, then seeing my character have more expression, like I haven't been caught off guard by it. But in all truth, like that isn't a kind of test that I've even noticed, right? Like I haven't gone back and replayed the story yet. So like, I think when I do, I'll be interested to see how I connect with that, knowing that I already have a connection with these characters, but in the story, my character does not at the moment.
So Shadowbringers was my first expansion story-wise, so I was already connected to my character.
Mm-hmm.
I just didn't know that much about the other characters, the NPCs. But like, I have my own story that was taking place in my head. Now I'm in 2.1, and I can tell you there are parts of 2.0 where I don't feel the warrior plight as me.
Yeah.
There are parts of it where it really doesn't feel like me, as opposed to an Endwalker. I was really invested. So I'm looking forward to seeing kind of where that transition is now that he's kind of described that.
Okay.
So he says, delving further into the story aspect, Final Fantasy XIV features the names of monsters, weapons, and actions which originated from Final Fantasy XI. Was it the idea of former Final Fantasy XI developers to include these references?
It's not something we planned out extensively, and that being said, 11 and 14 are the same in that they are both MMORPGs in the Final Fantasy series, and both borrow monsters and item names from previous titles, so it's somewhat inevitable that they feature the same names. Furthermore, the proposal for 14 originally began as the successor to 11 and intentionally includes elements from 11. As for weapon names, considering how 11 incorporates references from various mythologies, it'd be harder for us to make sure that there weren't any overlaps.
The Final Fantasy XIV staff in charge of lore and items have great respect for 11, so I believe the references come from their playfulness and their strong feeling towards previous titles in the series. Mr. Hayashi in particular has a long history of developing items for 11 as well, and he seems to bring over certain names that would evoke the memories of players who have played 11. I've never given him specific instructions regarding that aspect, but I do ask him to check with me when he'll be using the name of an item with great importance to the series.
It's honestly quite a struggle to give names to things in long-standing titles like 11 and 14.
Oh, job names are especially tough. After all, there is no point if a job is similar to its namesake in name only. Its gameplay experience needs to match the pre-established design too. At this point, I'm thinking we have no choice but to come up with brand new jobs that haven't appeared in a Final Fantasy series before. That's a huge reveal right there.
Mm-hmm. Well, The problem though is even in that regards, like from a gameplay element perspective, we've talked about this at some point, like, oh, that job feels just like this job. You know, you run that risk. And so them going in a direction where they're making stuff that hasn't appeared does come with the fact that it doesn't have any of this baggage, right? We just talked about in our previous video, Blue Mage, right? And so you don't have to sit here and adhere to these kind of predefined standards. But ultimately, everybody has a favorite Pokemon. Like you might even run the risk of somebody sitting here hoping for, like, you know, a time mage. Like for me, for example, if they introduced, you know, another mage style job, that having it have a connection with the past is exciting. It does that can be like nostalgic and hopeful, as opposed to something completely unique. There's no wrong or right answers. Like, I'm excited for whatever they decide to make, but you have to kind of think from a gameplay first perspective rather than the name first perspective. Otherwise you run the risk of just kind of creating this just feels just like every other.
Or Blue Mage, where it's just so different than expectations, it made a lot of people mad. As a TLDR, that's a summary of why Blitzball's not in the game.
Yeah.
Because every time they sit down and think about it, they don't feel they can pay it tribute.
Correct. And so then follows up, says, I certainly see why, considering there's already 22 jobs in 11 and 20 jobs in 14, meaning 7.0 could theoretically take 14 to match the same amount of jobs that exist in 11. I think 11 has the upper hand, though, especially with the sub job system, because it adds so much variability and you know, to the sandbox that is, you know, the gameplay, but it's heavily driven on the open world, where Final Fantasy 14 isn't in that regards. But so he says, as long as the new game elements aren't being introduced, the new jobs are designed to fulfill a battle role that can certainly be filled by an existing job. That said, we can't release a superior version of a certain job, and a new job that offers the same experience as an existing one would defeat the purpose of adding the new job. In that sense, it's very difficult to come up with a new job.
From a system perspective, if the number of jobs is fixed and well balanced, there's no need to add more. And adding new jobs would obviously cause a stir. But nevertheless, we always need to add more jobs to keep providing new gameplay experiences.
Back in the Chains of Promethea, we were heavily criticized by foreign media for releasing a new expansion without any new jobs. Considering that, we might say it's a rule of design to provide either a new job or a playable race as a main feature in a new expansion. And that is true. Like, one of the things that when you look at, like, Chains was the only Chains. I was like, I was saying Rise of the Zilliard in my head. Like, Chains was the only one that didn't introduce a new job, where Zilliard did, where Treasures did, where they all ended up having that as kind of a driving and exciting factor to the overall gameplay experience. But Chains is also considered one of the best expansions as a part of Final Fantasy XI's history to this day. It was so much that they added, and a lot of players were really to enjoy it. In fact, when they announced the mobile remake, which has since been shuttered, they announced that it would have all the content, I think, up through Chains, or some part of Chains that would be included in it. And people were like, that was actually kind of a big reveal, big moment, even though it never ended up coming to pass in that regards.
I would say that, like, I think it was Mr. Happy's Media Tour interview, which, by the way, he just put out a video kind of reminding everybody what content is planned for when, because we've learned so much about the roadmap of Endwalker, and I think it's easy to get all that jumbled in your mind. So people are like, wait, shouldn't we already have X? And so he put that video out, so go check that out. But in his interview, he kind of asked about, I think it was asked about kind of balancing the difficulty scale of jobs. And Yoshi-P referenced the job changing system, the jobstone system, is like, if you are getting to a point where you feel you've reached the end of your progression with a job, maybe you don't want to learn to play it at the next level, you've hit the edge of where that fun is, or you literally are, you know, perfect in ultimates or whatever, and you want a new challenge. That is why gear and the jobstone switching system is so easy, is because he's like, no, I encourage you, we'll start that journey over with a new job and let that be the variety in your gameplay experience. And so that is something they heavily lean on. As a precedent, though, adding 2 jobs per expansion, kind of minimum, is a very dangerous one, because at some point they may want to either slow down or stop altogether, like the number of dungeons we get per patch. And because you've set that precedent, it's now an expectation. And frustration and friction is where expectations and reality don't meet. And so the moment they say, hey, this expansion, we're really excited to add 1 new job, the answer isn't going to be, wow, I'm so excited for that job. It's going to go, where's the rest of my new jobs? And we're going to be like, whoa, you said spare no expense. You owe me 2 brand new, fun, well-balanced, well-developed, cosmetically interesting, gameplay interesting, but balanced, but not homogenized, you owe me those 2 every expansion. And like, where does that stop? At 22 jobs, 24 jobs, 30 jobs? Like, you're creating a bigger and bigger and bigger problem.
Yeah, exactly.
For the
All
sake
right.
of fun.
That was a great interview. I think lots of really cool insight, especially as it relates to some of the development having had an insight into Yoshi-P. As an 11 player, I want them to support 11 more, and I hope that it's got a future. And some of the AMA stuff, if Square Enix decides to spare no expense and invest it in 11, I think that would be like, that's where we could start to see some of these things. But at the end of the day, I guess it's just something we're going to be left hoping, waiting, holding our breath for, and whatnot. Chris, why don't you take us out?
I'll say thanks to everybody coming in. We do film these live if you want to come hang out over on Twitch. And so it's nice to kind of read your comments as we go. We try to work them into conversation where it makes sense. And then I say hi to you after. And then thanks again to Farmer Girl for another gifted sub. So come hang out with us on Twitch. But otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Take care.